to the Rancocas Nature Center. The Rancocas Nature Center is located at the eastern end of the Rancocas State Park on Rancocas Road in West Hampton, New Jersey. Today, we are going to be doing a fern walk, and the walk is going to be led by Karl Anderson. Karl Anderson is the founding sanctuary director of the Rancocas Nature Center. His term here was from 1977, when the center opened, until 2003. So Karl, take it over.
Yes, I'm Karl Anderson, and this is my staff. Uh, Ferns. Some groups of plants have charisma. You think about it. Uh, People who don't even know what's growing in their own backyard. If you say, "I want to show you an orchid," they'll sort of wake up and go look at the orchid. And people do orchid field trips, and there are orchid societies, and of course there are carnivorous plant societies. You don't hear about mustard societies or cucumber societies, but some plants do have charisma, and I think ferns fall into that category. There's just something about them. For all that, they're a relatively minor group of plants. And in North America, there are about 19,000 vascular plants. Vascular plants being plants that have true roots, leaves, and some kind of vein system that brings nutrients and water up and down the stem of the plant. There are about 19,000 vascular plant species in North America, and there are only about 450 species of ferns. And that proportion is about true in New Jersey. New Jersey has 2,700 species of vascular plants growing without cultivation, as the saying goes, and we only have 59 species of ferns. And alas, for you folks who live in the southwestern counties of New Jersey, like Burlington, Camden, Gloucester, and Salem, we only have about 30 species here, including a couple of species that are only found in the pine barrens. They're not a monolithic group. The 59 species of ferns we have in New Jersey are in 18 different families of ferns. Contrast that, for instance, with all the grasses in New Jersey, 250 species. They're all in one family. This variation is perhaps due to the fact that they've been around for a long time. They appeared about 360 million years ago, and they were dominant plants, not dominant land plants, for probably several hundred million years, which is why if you look at movies like Jurassic Park, they always seem to have big fern colonies featured. So the ferns we see today are probably a kind of a mixed bag. I mean, some of them are relatively fast developing families, and they're spinning off new species and changing. Some ferns are literally living fossils. Some ferns are living fossils and been around for 300 million years. And some ferns we see are probably remnants, relics of a time long past when they were dominant, but have now been relegated to obscurity because of climate change and the uprising and changing of the configuration of continents and so forth. So they're an interesting group and a complicated group, even though there are not very many of them. So my thought is now we should take a walk and show you about 10 species of ferns that are here on the Nature Center property. Okay, the first thought you would have would be, well, how do you go about identifying a fern? Well, the first thing to have, if you're smart, is to have a checklist of the local ferns. So you don't have to go through a 10 volume book of fern identification. Some obvious things would be size. We have some ferns that would be 3 feet tall, and others might only be a few inches tall in New Jersey. And we might consider also habit of growth. I think most people, if you say what's a fern look, they would draw a kind of a vase-shaped plant with fronds, leaves coming up from a single point, and that makes sense. Many ferns grow from a short, clumping root, but many ferns also grow from a spreading rootstock, basically an underground stem that will send up a frond at intervals. So if you go to size up a fern, you'll look at it like this one, you say, well, it doesn't seem to have any logical center of growth. I mean, these are all kind of connected. And some of these fern colonies can get huge. They can be acres and acres of the same fern, all growing from one rootstock and basically one plant. A little bit of terminology, a little bit, everything has special terminology. We don't have any ferns in New Jersey that have a woody stem. In the tropics, there are tree ferns that have a woody stem. We don't have anything of that in New Jersey. So the conventional word for the above ground, let's say, growth of a fern, we call this the frond, and the leafy section we call the blade. And the blade is usually divided in some fashion, and that is one of the important ways of identifying a fern, is how lacy, how much divided is the blade. Now, if we look at this one, we see that if this were the entire blade, we can see that it's divided into leaflets. There's a word for them. They call them pinnae. You can call them a leaflet. It's divided into leaflets. But you notice that these leaflets themselves, especially up at the end of the fern, the end of the blade, are actually all connected. So this blade is deeply lobed, and the lobes in turn are shallowly lobed. You could say, you have a fern a blade that is sort of not really very lacy looking, not very ferny looking. This particular fern is called Sensitive Fern. It's an abundant fern, generalist, grows in all kinds of soil, usually damp, but not always. It has a few lookalikes, but you'll notice on this one, these leaflets, the pinnae, are set up opposite each other. See, the technical word for a fern is vascular cryptogam, having a conspicuous alternation of generations. You need not know that. But ferns are propagated by spores in a kind of a two-stage fashion. Spores are single cells, somewhat analogous to a pollen grain. And they're disseminated in huge quantities. One fern plant can produce millions of spores. They blow in the wind, and if you land on a suitable substrate, that little spore will divide by fission and produce a little elliptical green plant about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch across. And that little plant in turn will produce sperms and eggs, and those sperms and eggs will of course get together and create a new fern plant. So you have this big conspicuous spore producing plant, and then a very inconspicuous sexually reproducing plant, which will propagate again a spore producing plant. So that's this alternation of generations. You need not know that. Spores can be found in various places. Some ferns, probably most ferns, you can find clusters of spore-bearing tissue on the back of the blade. But there are some ferns that produce what is called a fertile frond that has no function other than producing spores. Oftentimes it's not even photosynthetic. And let's see, I just saw one here. Here we go. That's an incipient fertile frond of Sensitive Fern. Used to be called bead fern sometimes. A bunch of little globes about 1/8 of an inch across, and if you broke one of those open on the inside, it was completely ripe, you'd see a whole lot of little round structures, and each one of those little round structures would have 64 spores in it. So if you figure there are probably several hundred of these little capsules here, and in each one of those there might be 100 little so-called sporangia, the spore-producing structures, and each sporangia has 64 spores in it. You can imagine that that little Scented frond alone could probably produce, well, do the numbers, but 100,000 spores. This is another fern that has a creeping underground stem. So if you look at this tangle of stuff, this is probably all one plant, okay, of a fern called hay-scented fern. The old fern books would say, it smells like new mown hay. Well, I'll tell you, I was raised on Manhattan's East Side. I have no idea what new mown hay is supposed to smell like. This is an unusually big, unusually healthy, big fronds of this stuff. Usually it's about half that height, so it just goes to show that size can mess you up. But if you can maybe get a look at that, you can see here the leaflets, the pinnae, are absolutely separate. They're not joined together at any point. They all have their own little stem, okay? And each leaflet in turn is divided in a rather fine fashion. It's deeply cut, and the little divisions in turn are deeply cut. So that's your, I think, the typical notion that people have of what a fern looks like. If you bought a bouquet from the florist and it had some ferns in it, it'd be something that looked like this. If you got something like that, you'd say, I ordered ferns, you know, but this is hay-scented fern. And this can be a rather confusing fern, but the thing is that it doesn't grow in it's a colony-forming fern. And I've seen this covering up like 20 acres. It's very, very tough. It'll grow in dry soil. You can see this. You can see the little areas of spore-bearing tissue, little tiny brown dots. At this stage of our knowledge, if we came across this fern, we might be tempted to say, oh, that's some more hay-scented fern. But then we would see that, these plants are coming up from a single rootstock. Notice here how they all are coming up from more or less one point. So that's not hay-scented fern. Well, what is it? Well, this is an interesting fern. This is called lady fern. Okay. Oh, and here we can see some very interesting the spore-bearing tissues are linear. Actually, they're so linear with a current. They used to say like a lady's eyelashes, but I have no idea what a lady's eyelashes looks like in these things. So that's lady fern, and it's a large fern, woodland fern, clump forming. The lower leaflets, the lowest pinnae, are relatively narrow, shorter than the ones in the middle, and kind of reflex. They pop up out of the plane of the thing, sort of like angel wings. And that's a good. We want to hold on to that fact because there are some confusing ferns that look like this. Now we're getting into the confusing ferns. So that's lady fern. Here's another fern. You'll also find it growing with lady fern. Rather similar. Sorry for the beat up specimen, but look at that lowest leaflet. Look here. See how triangular that is? When you see that triangular lowest leaflet, that typically means that it's one of the so-called wood ferns. It's a different genus, Triopteris. And compare this lowest leaflet there with the lady fern. See a difference in shape. We are now down in a floodplain. and you get a different set of ferns than you would in an upland. So, okay, we've talked about size and habit of growth as ways of identifying ferns. And then, of course, there's also habitat. Some ferns grow on dry slopes. Some ferns only grow on masonry, and some ferns are typically in a wetland. This is another species of wood fern. This is crested wood fern. If you look at the lowest leaflet, you'll see that it is triangular, just as it was in the last one. These lower leaves are sterile, so not all the fronds are going to have spores on the back of them. This was a very tall fern. This fern was this tall. Okay, you got another specimen here. Very narrow, very narrow fertile frond. Very narrow and very tall, and very conspicuous round fruit dots, sori, whatever word you want to use. Very conspicuous sori. Probably the most typical Burlington County fern in seriously wet habitat is the cinnamon fern. And this is an example. They can get large. They can get up to 3 feet tall. This is just a small individual. Very tight, very obvious clump forming. The habitat alone will give it to you pretty well. Now, in this species, the spores are born on a separate fertile stalk in the same general sense as that sensitive fern. Let's see here. So that fertile frond comes up in the spring, and after the spores are disseminated, that's what's left of the fertile frond. Called cinnamon fern because the fertile frond, which comes up above the leaves, actually looks to be covered with cinnamon brown fuzz. And if you look very seriously at that cinnamon brown fuzz, you'll see that it's thousands of little sporangia, thousands of little spore-producing organelles. We've got another fern here that superficially looks very much like sensitive fern. And I'm sorry now that I don't have a sample of sensitive fern in my hand. But in sensitive fern, these lobes were invariably opposite. Here they are typically alternate. Also, the edge of the lobes in sensitive fern were sort of shallowly lobed. Here, some of them actually have very fine teeth. This is called netted chain fern, and it's a sensitive fern look-alike. It's a wetland fern. This is only going to be found in an acid wetland. Oddly enough, like the sensitive fern, it produces a fertile frond that doesn't look anything like the fertile frond of sensitive fern. So that's the fertile frond of the netted chain fern. Sensitive fern, if you remember, had little beads strung on the stick. And if you look at the back, there's your spore-bearing tissues. This is a northern representative of a somewhat tropical group of ferns. Another one of these ferns that grows in a tangled mass. This is a rather delicate little fern called bog fern or Massachusetts fern. It grows like that netted chain fern. It grows exclusively in acid wetlands. So this is a fern you will find in Burlington County, but you probably wouldn't find it, say, in Sussex County, unless you had a black spruce bog or something. So there are three ferns, three related ferns in the same genus, the Lepidopteris. There's a New York fern, a marsh fern, and a bogfart. And in New York fern, which we hopefully will see, the frond tapers down to zero. So you have a couple of tiny, tiny leaflets at the bottom. And marsh fern, it doesn't taper, they hardly taper at all, and we'll see that in a little while. And then this one is sort of intermediate. The spores on this, the spore-bearing tissue, would be on some fronds, but not all. Usually you can pick out the spore-bearing ones because they're a little taller. And you look at the back of that, you can see all the spore-bearing tissues, the so-called sori, little patches of spore-bearing tissues. Got a fern here that is being buried in the non-native stilt grass. This is marsh fern. Rather similar, same genus as that bog fern that I just showed you. Very similar, actually, except you don't have quite the same degree of taper in the frond. This is about as big as it gets. I don't see any fertile fronds right here, but it would be the same kind of thing. The fertile frond would be very narrow, and the back of the frond would have lots of little sori, lots of little fruit dots. So these ferns that are sticking up here are, I believe, all marsh fern. A few small plants here of New York fern, which is notorious because it's a relatively small fern, usually in, oh, we've got a caterpillar in there. Gets to be about a foot tall, a little 18 inches tall, something like that. Usually in an upland, in this case it's on the edge of a wetland, but the characteristic is that it's the only fern we have that tapers down in both directions to zero. And they used to say New Yorkers burned a candle at both ends. No, don't buy that. And Psilipteris noveboracensis. Boricum is the old Roman name for the city of York in England. So New York becomes Novoboricum. So in some plant names like New York ironweed and New York fern, you've got things like Psilipteris noveboracensis of New York. Why of New York? I have no idea. That's your New York fern. So we've seen the three species in this genus Psilipteris: the New York fern, and the bog fern, and the marsh fern. Okay, we're getting back now to the Nature Center. I guess we've finished our little walk. I thought it was quite productive. I guess we've looked at a dozen species of ferns, which is actually more than I expected to find. Quite a nice beginning course in ferns. Those are about the species that you would find in any rich deciduous woods in Burlington County. If you get into the pine barrens, you would probably find some additional species. But it's been a pleasure to be here, and hope you enjoyed this video.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for joining us today. Please visit the Rancocas Nature Center website, rancocasnaturecenter.org. There is a lot of information about the center there and all the programs we offer, about some of our Nature Quest kits that we are working on currently, and ways to contribute to the center. Thank you very much.